You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
So our guest on today's TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour is TBR Magazine Board of Editors member Clint Lacy. And for those of you who read the magazine, you know that Clint had an excellent article in the March-April issue on the Knights of the Golden Circle. That, of course, being a subject of great interest to those of us who like to study the finer details of the war between the states. Of course, for those of us who are looking for alternate explanations of things, the Knights of the Golden Circle definitely never fails to offer those alternative explanations. And so, Clint, welcome to the Dixie Heritage Hour. Your article on the Knights of the Golden Circle, the thing that really intrigued me about it from the very beginning, probably because at the time that this airs, I'll be in Havana, Cuba. Perhaps I might have even come home by the time this airs. But you had mentioned that the Knights of the Golden Circle was actually organized not in Charleston or Richmond or Savannah or Atlanta or any New Orleans or any of what you would consider the points of the Southland, but that they actually met in and organized in Havana, Cuba.
That's correct. They organized in Havana, and we were discussing in our first attempt at this interview, you were wondering why Havana. So it was probably more clandestine, more secret. It was out of the country's borders, but it was also central to what the proposed goals of the territory that would include the Knights of the Golden Circle or the Golden Circle.
Well, you had said that territory would have gone as far north as St. Louis and Baltimore, and also would have encompassed Mexico and several Caribbean islands, Central America.
Yeah, I've got the article pulled up, and I was trying to find the exact wording. It said the Knights of the Golden Circle was organized in 1856 in Havana. Its purpose was to create a new empire embracing the territory within a radius of 16 degrees, or about 1,200 miles. The westmost boundary would be St. Louis, and the northmost boundary would be Baltimore, with the southern boundary being Central America and Mexico.
And so that's quite a bit of real estate, and it's also a very multi-ethnic. In other words, it wasn't just white Southerners that would encompass. Obviously, Mexico, South America, Central America, Jamaica, very different cultures, very different racial compositions and so forth. Everything from Mayan to Creole to, you name it.
Yeah. Hispanic, those Native American, all of it.
Yeah, so it would have been, and it would have required conquering quite a bit of real estate, because obviously Mexico, Jamaica, Cuba, which I think might have been called Hispaniola at the time, but it was part of Spain, would have had to have been conquered. Mexico, of course, was in the possession of the French. The different Central American countries were pretty much all colonies at the time. They were either British or French or Spanish or whatever they were. Of course, some of those islands would have been Dutch. A lot of people to have to go to war with to conquer their real estate.
A lot, yeah.
Pretty ambitious plan.
Very ambitious. They had planned to invade Mexico twice. And the third time they were planning on doing it, Lincoln was elected, so they had to focus their attention domestically here in the States.
Right.
So the focus became secession.
I had asked you before about Maximilian, the Emperor of France, because he was not the Emperor of France, I'm sorry, but he was the Emperor of French-controlled Mexico. And of course, the Mexicans did not want Maximilian or the French there. And so his rulership of Mexico was always on shaky ground, but he was very much a supporter of the Confederacy. And I was asking if you thought that there might have been a connection between him and the Knights of the Golden Circle.
That it would make sense that he would support the Confederacy because the United States government would not want French
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. One of the theories that I've found in my study of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and you've probably discovered it as well, and you talked about the order kind of breaking up towards that time, but you didn't really go into detail in it in your article. But my understanding is that the Knights of the Golden Circle, coming into the 20th century, came to the conclusion that the South probably was not going to rise again, that they probably were not going to achieve their ends. And so they started giving a lot of the guns and a lot of the gold and a lot of the money that they had been stashing, a lot of the military supplies that they had been stashing in these caches to Pancho Villa, and that is what funded his failed Mexican Revolution. And if that's the case, then, is it possible that these sentinels have been guarding for no one? For whatever reason, they're just, like you said, the one grandfather was training the grandson to be a sentinel. Would he have not known that there was no one left to come and claim this one day? Or was it just that he was trying to keep it in the family, and so that way the family would have, a guarantee of wealth for future generations?
Well, that's hard to say, because Bob talked about getting close to one cache, I believe, in Arkansas, and evidently he was being watched because there was a dummy hanging from a tree, kind of a signal to back off. And another one, he was out west somewhere, and they were looking for a cache, and a helicopter just out of the blue showed up. People wanted to know what they were doing there. So I have to believe that there has to be some use for it. What I don't know. I know that they diversified their money into such things as railroads and timber. And as one friend pointed out, you look at the inventor of Coca-Cola, I believe he was a colonel, wasn't he? Pemberton.
Yes.
Not the same Pemberton of Vicksburg, but a different one. And he leaves the war with no money. And a few years later, he invents Coca-Cola and starts this huge company. So they certainly seem to still be in the business of generating revenue. What they're doing with it, I don't know. But I do know this. At one time, the KGC had declared Nashville, Tennessee, their headquarters. And I thought it was really odd. I guess it was around 2008, back when the Tea Party was really springing up. They held their convention in Nashville. And it just made me wonder a little bit. Was that just a coincidence, or was that money being funneled into, the Tea Party? I don't know. As we both know, though, the Tea Party got co-opted and pretty much has disintegrated.
Right.
But I really wondered about that, since the KGC's headquarters was in Nashville. And the Tea Party came along, supposedly at the time, to really challenge the status quo in the federal government, and they held their convention in Nashville. It really made me wonder.
Well, another thing I've wondered, too, because Albert Pike was pretty big in the Knights of the Golden Circle, and he was also very much a leader in Freemasonry, having even written the Morals and Dogma book that's basically the Bible that lays out each of the 33 degrees of the order. Is it possible that the Knights of the Golden Circle was, shall we say, maybe a 34th degree of Masonry at some point? Or that at some point, as the organization started winding down, that maybe it sort of got absorbed back into Masonry, or some of its members were also Masons, and maybe there's an inner group of Masons that have kind of been the continuance of the Knights of the Golden Circle. I don't really know how to articulate the question. Hopefully you understand kind of what I'm trying to ask you.
Yeah, I do. Well, we know that it was designed, George Bickley, who was supposedly from Indiana, was the founder of the KGC, and I believe he was living in Cincinnati at the time he founded it. He's the one that set up the charter and all the rituals, and it was very much similar to the Masonic order. Instead of the only difference really being, instead of a worshipful master, the leader was called a captain, and instead of a lodge, their chapters were called a castle. So it was heavily influenced by the Masonic order. We know that. As far as it being absorbed, I don't have any idea on that. I could speculate, but I don't know.
I wonder if maybe there's a group of Masons who they know who one another are, and maybe their fellow Masons don't even realize who they are, who are kind of still keeping the secrets of the KGC today.
It's very possible. Just as Bob Brewer's grandfather was teaching him, it's certainly possible that certain members of a Masonic order were taught themselves by members of their family or members of the order. There are still people that know how to read the signs, and they know where it is, and they're still guarding it. And I have to assume they're still guarding the gold and silver for a reason.
Even if the Knights of the Golden Circle are completely defunct, I would assume that if you knew about a stash of gold, and of course you live near the Ozarks, if you knew that somewhere in a cave that there was, a big stash of gold or big stash of something that you could tap into from time to time, obviously you'd want to keep anybody else from finding it and taking it all, because it'd be like you'd have your own little piggy bank, which, like you said, at some point you need to buy a car, or you need to make a major repair to your house, or one of your children gets married or something, and it's nice to be able to pull out several $1,000s at a time and take care of your business without necessarily taking it all at once and just going to town with it. And of course, you wouldn't want anybody else to find out about it, because you would want for yourself and maybe even your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren to be able to have that security.
Yes. And when you get into the subject of Jesse James and or the Knights of the Golden Circle, you'll quickly realize there are a lot of different factions. Mm-hmm. And not all of them like each other, and not all of them believe each other. And it's very clandestine,
Right.
It's a rabbit hole, really. The paydays, the jars full of money buried throughout the area where the cash is nearby. Guarding the cash was a lifelong commitment. So that was your compensation. You don't touch the big stash, but there's a lot of little stashes around that you can access if you need it. Something else I want to note is the KGC, Knights of the Golden Circle, they didn't just have members in the South. There were also members in the North, and more importantly, there were also members in the Union Army. The 109th Illinois Infantry was disbanded because of quote-unquote disloyalty. And there's different versions of that story. Some say that the men didn't agree with the way the Southerners' property were being destroyed. Some say that they didn't agree with emancipation. And some people say that they were genuine members of the Knights of the Golden Circle. But the entire regiment was disbanded. I think 8 officers were arrested. And they were made up of men from Union County, Illinois, which is, I'm on the edge of the Ozarks, but if you travel about 40 miles east, you get to the Mississippi River, and across it is Illinois. So Union County, Illinois is maybe 45 miles from me. And it's part of an area that was called, and still is called, Little Egypt. And it was very sympathetic to the South during the war. So the men of the 109th, it's very easy to believe that they could be members or were led by members because of their sympathies. Information I read leads me to believe that, yes, they volunteered for the Army, the United States Army, but one main reason was because they didn't want to get drafted.
Right.
So, but yes, an entire regiment was disbanded. And I know at one time there was a company of men in Cairo, Illinois, which is probably a little over an hour from me, where the Mississippi and Ohio rivers meet. And Jeff Thompson, the Confederate general of the Swamp Fox that operated in my area, he had a plan to have them deliver Cairo to him. And somehow or another it got exposed, and there were several men arrested and disbanded from there as well. So it's an organization that was filled in Northern and Southern ranks.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed, and that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
I remember when I was a teenager, I remember having to go to court. And one of the things I remember, my grandfather knew who the judge was going to be in the courtroom that day. And I remember he showed me some gestures. And I wish I could remember them now. He told me to make sure that I kind of, quietly, but he's at the same time, make sure that the judge sees you making these gestures. He said, you may need to make them more than once. He said, and eventually the judge will nod and let you know that he's seen the gesture. And then when that happens, he said, of course, you're good. And basically what it was these gestures were indicating to the judge that I was the family member of a 32nd degree Mason in distress. And immediately the judge nodded, and then he began to, he lit into me. He made me think I was, about to spend the rest of my life in prison over a traffic violation. And then he dropped all the charges. And I had been in an automobile accident, and of course, there was there was quite a bit of stickiness involved in that. But anyways, well, let's put it this way: I had been involved in an automobile accident, drag racing.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so
it was a really big favor.
Yeah,
that was being asked.
Yeah, but I know that these kind of gestures in secret societies exist, and obviously they work. They worked for me that day, and they, as I understand it from reading your article at but you had mentioned in your article at the Battle of Antietam that the Confederates and the Union soldiers passed these signs back and forth to one another, and essentially what should have been an easy Yankee victory ended up being a bunch of Yankee soldiers simply went into a retreat and let the Southerners have the field.
I believe they exclaimed the term. The officer was eager, and he charged the center of the Union line, but he didn't know he was being outflanked. So he got cut off with only 2 companies, I guess. And it would have been certain defeat. And they started exclaiming, Red Rose to the rescue. And the Union soldiers just stopped. And like you said, walked away. The Southerners were able to walk away. By all accounts, they should have been prisoners. But they were simply able to just walk off the field. The information I accessed, it says that Red Rose was chosen because a red rose grows in the north and the south. So Southerners facing Northerners realize they're trapped. They give the red rose, exclamation, and they're allowed to walk away.
And I'm going to guess that wasn't the only battle where stuff like that happened. That was just the one that you made reference to in the article.
Yes. That's the one example I found, but I'm sure there are many more examples. Just like prisoner exchanges were very common until Grant ended them. And I would say probably that the being able to exclaim Red Rose to the rescue probably worked until, I would imagine that Grant put a stop to that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he was willing to stop prisoner exchanges, he was probably willing to stop this from happening too.
So there were several people who believed John Wilkes Booth to have been a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle.
Yes, I believe he was as well.
And of course, the conspiracy to kill Lincoln, I believe, was a lot broader than John Wilkes Booth. For example, General Grant and his wife should have been in the booth at Ford's Theater that night, and they were not. And so someone had to make the arrangements for the general not to be there. Of course, there were sentries posted in the alley. There were sentries posted in the stairway. There were sentries posted at the entrance to the president's private balcony there in the theater. And those sentries had to conveniently be missing. In other words, somebody had to facilitate John Wilkes Booth even being able to get into the private balcony with the president. And then somebody would have to be able to facilitate his escape route. And I believe that person was probably William Stanton.
Very possible.
And of course, that would mean that perhaps Stanton would have been in the Knights of the Golden Circle as well, and possibly even other members of Lincoln's cabinet.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of animosity toward Lincoln. When Lincoln, right when the war first began, basically he said he was neither for nor against slavery. If he could preserve the Union with slavery, he'd do it. If he could preserve the Union without slavery, he'd do it. Most of the Northerners could get behind that. But whenever he started making the war about freeing the slaves, there was a lot of contention there. Because contrary to popular belief, Northerners had no love for slaves or free slaves, period. And there were laws in northern states where you couldn't be there after dark. You couldn't move there unless you put up some outrageous bond. I mean, all these were protections put in place to keep their areas white. And let's face it, the West, they didn't want it to be a slave-holding area because it was understood that territory was reserved for the white man. So there are a lot of myths about the war. We hear that it was about to free the slaves. No, it was only about to free the slaves whenever it became politically convenient and necessary for Lincoln. Before the election of 1864, he was very unpopular. They were losing a lot of battles. And even after the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg for the Union, he was still not guaranteed to win the presidential race of 1864. So in 1863, they roll out the Emancipation Proclamation in order to make it look like they had the moral high ground. And everybody knows long after the war, these laws were still in place. Certain cities, if you were a black man, you were warned. You cannot be there after sundown. There's a town about 35, 40 miles north of me, and up till about, 15, 18 years ago, I know, they still had laws on the books saying that blacks could not be there after sundown.
Well, I can remember there was a billboard in a little town called Waller, Texas. And basically the billboard, it said, colored man, make sure that you're on the other side of this sign before the sun goes down.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah, and, they said that at least officially, you talk to the mayor, you talk to the chief of police, you talk to people on the town council, and they would say that they kept that billboard up basically to show how bigoted the town had been once upon a time. That's why they maintained the sign, and the billboard was, kind of as a testimony to the bigotry of the town in generations past. But that was just the cover.
Right, of course.
Yeah,
they were just...
In all reality, that the town's all-white police force was very prepared to make your life uncomfortable if you did not heed the sign.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of examples of that, and there are a lot of examples of it in the North as well. Mm-hmm. It was all political chicanery, if you will, smoke and mirrors, whatever you want to call it. It was a ploy to give the North the moral high ground. All of a sudden, instead of trying to keep the South in bondage into a union they did not want to be part of anymore, now all of a sudden it was for this great, high, and lofty reason, this godly work to free the slaves. And that is the myth that is repeated to this day.
You had talked about the origin of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and it seemed from what you had written that their motivation was not so much the establishment of a Southern nation for the Southern nation's sake, that large circle that they chose was because that area was the country's and the world's central area for the production of cotton, sugar, and some other agricultural commodities. And so the Knights of the Golden Circle was really seeking to corner the world's agricultural markets.
Yes, it was going to create a monopoly. And like I said, that was the focus until Lincoln got elected. Then the focus became secession. I've got one book I read several years ago called With the Border Ruffians. And it was about an Irishman that immigrated to the United States. And he came in through Virginia and through Missouri. And he wound up settling in Kansas before it was a state. It was still a territory, and this was during Bleeding Kansas. And he staked out his claim and talked about how somebody tried to steal his claim, Northerners. So he just said, forget it. And he went to Texas and ended up buying a ranch, I guess kind of southwest of San Antonio. And he actually talks about being in the Knights of the Golden Circle. And he stated that the object was to push through secession.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org.
Well, there's an interesting little side story here in the article about Lambden Purdy Milligan. He lived from 1812 through 1899, was an Ohio-born Huntington, Indiana farmer and lawyer. He was briefly an international celebrity in the USA and the CSA, but with Lincoln's War of Terror against Northern Copperheads, Milligan came under suspicion for his supposed connection to the conspiracy to array large groups in the Old Northwest against the Union of 1863. A member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, he was jailed by the Lincoln administration, and a military found him guilty. He protested his trial, leading to the important ex parte Milligan U.S. Supreme Court ruling that civilian courts are supreme over military courts. Huntington and the surrounding county were for decades prior to the war an all-white community with laws that any black must leave it by sundown. Milligan had a jail-like stone building he used to hold runaway slaves until they could be returned to their owners, according to local sources. So this ties right into what I was telling you. There were Northern members of the KGC as well. And in this area of Indiana, there were rules against no blacks, and he even had a slave house that he kept slaves to sell back to their masters. And it mentioned a Northwest conspiracy, which reminded me, at some point in time during the war, the Knights of the Golden Circle's signs and countersigns, passwords, rituals, all this were compromised, and a newspaper published them. So General Sterling Price of Missouri formed another group under a different name. Translated in French, it means a Southern League. And
so Dr. Michael Hill's The League of the South is really secretly the continuation of Sterling Price's Southern League.
If memory serves me right, the League of the South was called the Southern League at first. But there was actually a Negro baseball league.
Okay.
In the early 20th century, and I don't know.
Well, you know where they came up with the name Southern League, as I understand the origination of this, is that there was a conference, a kind of, I don't want to call it a Civil War roundtable conference, but it was kind of a conference of people who were studying Southern history, and Dr. Michael Hill and Dr. Clyde Wilson and some others were speaking at it, and Dr. Hill was speaking to the group, and Clyde Wilson handed him a slip of paper, and written on the slip of paper was the name Southern League. And literally Dr. Hill, basically asked anybody who would want to see the formation of an independent Southern States of America to go line up on a wall on a certain side of the room, and 15 or 16 people lined up over there, and Dr. Hill basically said he was starting the Southern League with that group of people.
Yeah, I was looking for the original French term.
And so if Clyde Wilson was the one who suggested that name, then maybe the real conspiracy theory I need to float out here on the radio today is that Clyde Wilson has been secretly maintaining Sterling Price's secret society for all of these generations.
Well, it'd make for good interest.
Of course, you realize I'm being light here, and maybe I shouldn't be so light with someone who has been such a great scholar of our history. But Dr. Clyde Wilson also knows that I'm his friend and very much his admirer. So I'm
I was going to say, don't you think he might laugh along with us?
Yes.
But the term I was looking for was Corps de Belgique.
Okay.
And that's French, and it translates to Southern League. And then that became the Order of American Knights, or OAK. And that was organized prior to Sterling Price's return to Missouri. He was going to try and recapture Missouri from the South. And he had all these OAK members out there that were supposed to rise up when he came in, and it didn't exactly turn into that. But the plan was to form a Northwest Confederation. And when I mean Northwest, I don't mean present-day Northwest like Idaho, Washington. This was like Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and the goal was if they could create a Northwestern Confederacy, that would split the Union in two. Mm-hmm. And you know, if had they been successful.
But you don't think that all the New England Yankees would have been fighting to get through that Northwest Confederacy to Starbucks?
No, I don't. And I'll tell you what. I think they would have paid somebody to, or maybe have written a very strongly worded letter in a op-ed.
Yeah. Forgive me, I shouldn't have interrupted your train of thought like that.
But no, I was going to say, if they'd been successful in doing that, there's no way the North could have beat the South.
Right.
They just would not have had the manpower. So, very intriguing, very interesting stuff.
So we're bouncing around a lot, and we kind of talked about it a little bit a few minutes ago. But do you think the Knights of the Golden Circle are still operating today, or is it one of those things that we'll just never know?
Well, we know that in 1916, they decided to seal all their records, divest the money into, like I said earlier, timber, mining, industries, things like that. And the records were not supposed to be reopened until the last Confederate died, which was in the 1950s. But we never know if the records were reopened or not. But that was the plan. They were supposed to be reopened after the last Confederate soldier died.
Well, where you said the records were sealed, they had to have been stored somewhere.
Yeah, it doesn't tell us that.
Okay.
I've not been able to find it anyway. But, yeah, they were supposed to leave them sealed until the last Confederate soldier died, which would have been in the 1950s. And then we don't know what they did with them after that.
Right.
But if there's still people out there guarding these caches, you have to wonder, there must be some use for them, or these people would have simply took the money for themselves. You know, I don't think it would be to reform the Confederacy, because if they had that much power, I don't think we would be seeing all the names changed and all the statues taken down and state governments trying to take stars off of flags because they were Confederates, or judges and politicians proposing in a yearbook in a fraternity with one. I just don't think if they were still in power, this stuff would be going on. I mean, I don't know how you see it, but it boggles my mind. The money's still out there. It's still being guarded. But why isn't it being put to use?
Well, you know what has always intrigued me, and I had written briefly about it in Dixie Heritage well over a year ago. I would have to dig through maybe 2 years of archives to find the issue that it was in. But all of the Confederate monuments around the country are targeted for removal. There's a list. The Southern Poverty Law Center maintains this list. Mm-hmm. And each one is targeted for removal. That list is prioritized. In other words, they have prioritized them in the order of which they're going to allocate resources to target their removal. The goal is to eventually remove each and every last one of them. But, you know, you can only bus around protesters and people to speak at city council meetings and everything, you know, pretending that they live in the area when they're really from Seattle or somewhere, to speak against these things. Even though they've targeted everyone for removal, you know, there's resources that need to be moved around and so forth. But there's one that's not on the list.
I know where this is going.
And that is the statue of Confederate General Albert Pike in Washington, D.C.
That one will never be on the list.
And when someone had suggested to the Secretary of the Interior here was it a year ago, 2 years ago? I can't remember now. But someone I can't remember who it was. It was just somebody who happened to make reference to the fact that, you know, Pike was a Confederate general. You know, should we consider, you know, removing the Pike statue? It was like all the force of the federal government came down to protect that statue. Mm-hmm. They were willing to remove every other Confederate monument in D.C. and even across the river in Virginia. But Pike's statue was not to be touched. And, of course, Pike was also the leader of Freemasonry in this country at one time, and he was also, one of the movers and shakers in the Knights of the Golden Circle.
Yeah, he was the foremost authority on Freemasonry. And you mentioned morals and dogma. Mm-hmm. And that's very interesting, very deep stuff. And there's been a lot of conversation over it because you probably know this. Who does he say is the light in morals and dogma?
Lucifer.
Now, people have said, well, Lucifer means light. He was just referencing the light. But it's hard for me to take it other than just face value.
Well, I'll tell you where I had a hard time, and I've still not made it all the way through Morals and Dogma. But I'll tell you where the reading became very difficult for me. Was at the conclusion of chapter 3, which, of course, each chapter being what you need to know at each particular degree of Masonry. And so at the conclusion of chapter 3, which is basically the great truth that's revealed to you when you receive your third degree of Masonry. The conclusion of chapter 3, he said, Masonry is the Babylonian mystery religion. Which means starting with degree 4, they begin to teach you what the Babylonian mystery religion is. But that was his closing statement at the end of chapter 3, was that Masonry is the Babylonian mystery religion. So, that pretty much settled it for me that
well, and here's the thing, I hate to go on this whole other subject.
Right.
But isn't that what the Talmud is? Basically, it is a spiritualism based on Babylonian religion. Am I wrong on this?
No. And a lot of people would also say that Talmudic religion and Kabbalah and so forth are very Luciferian. That they're not Jehovah centric; they're Lucifer centric.
Yes. Wasn't it Solomon that took on Babylonian wives? Am I correct on that?
Solomon had wives from everywhere.
I think it was Solomon who embraced some of their beliefs and their religions, and some of them were Babylonian.
Right.
So, yeah, it's the nice way to put it is spiritual mysticism. Mm-hmm. That's how Kabbalah and the study of the Talmud is often described. But, when he says in Morals and Dogma, and I want to be clear here, I'm not bashing any Masons.
Right.
I almost joined myself at one time. I was a member of the International Order of Odd Fellows until the state closed our lodge down. But when he says that, it sends off a lot of alerts to me. And Pike also predicted the First War and the Second World War, and told how the third one would go and how they were going to accomplish that third one. Very interesting stuff. So maybe in this discussion of this, maybe we can reconcile what maybe happened to the KGC. Maybe their focus, pure speculation on my part, maybe their focus turned to what Pike taught in accomplishing his goals. I don't know.
Well, you talked about how in 1916 that money started to be redirected into industry.
Yeah.
And so, of course, you live in the Ozark area, you live near some of these caches, and you just started a publishing company. So, did you start your publishing company with Knights of the Golden Circle loot?
If you've seen the account balance in my publishing company right now, you would not need to ask that question.
But you don't need to keep it in the bank if you've got it hidden in the cave, though.
That's true. And maybe if I find a cave full of money, I'll tell you about it. We can do some things.
Breaker one might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy Cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all, got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at our brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time with good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Whoop, whoop, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with him. I'm down and I'm gone.
I found in the archives of the Marble Hill newspaper, late 1880s, a guy come into the newspaper and told the editor that he spotted Jesse and Frank James on the old David Lutz property a mile south of Luttsville, which just happened to be my friend Scotty's farm. And if you look at his abstract of his land, it was once part of the David Lutz farm.
Huh.
And it was across the creek, behind the tree line, away from the main road, had a well on it. Just up the road was the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which still stands. And that is where all the Southerners went to church around here. And it just so happened to be one day after the Gads Hill train robbery.
Okay.
Which is in the next county. So, I don't know. Was there any money buried on Scotty's place? I don't know.
All right. So tell me about your publishing company, though. I understand that primarily you've started it to publish a couple of your own books, but you may also be publishing some books for some other folks as well.
Yeah, it's called Foothills Media, LLC. And I'm definitely publishing one of my books under it. I had a Truth Seeker's Guide to False Flags come out with TBR books. Originally the title was supposed to be A Beginner's Guide to False Flags. And I kind of like the ring of that one better, the sound of that title better. So it's going to be published under that title, A Beginner's Guide to False Flags. And I'm adding some additional information to it. Notes from the Sandy Hook shooting. There's some things that just don't reconcile with the official story. I'm not saying people didn't die. I also talk about the Pulse nightclub attack in Orlando, which this Muslim attacked a gay bar. Well, it turns out that his father was a police informant. Not only a police informant, but an FBI informant.
So that almost sounds like the punchline, like the setup for a joke. A Muslim from Afghanistan and an FBI informant walk into a gay bar. That's the setup for a joke.
Well, it is, which makes you wonder, because in my study of false flags, they're notoriously making stupid mistakes. And, they always leave breadcrumbs, and I don't know whether it's on purpose to say, ha, look what I done, you can't prove it, or are they just that stupid?
Right.
And the tidbit about Omar Mateen, that was the shooter's name at the Pulse nightclub. It was not found out till later. When Hillary Clinton came down there during the height of the presidential campaign in 2016, they were talking about what a tragedy this event was. And guess who was standing right behind her? Sadiq Mateen, Omar Mateen's father.
Wow.
And nobody noticed that until after the shooting. A local television station was going through tape and said, hey, isn't that Omar's father? So, and in both cases, both incidents were used to further the cause of gun control.
This is off subject here, and I may or may not even put this in the program, but Pat Shannon sent me a video today. And it was Barack Obama referring to his wife, Michelle, as Michael any of a number of occasions.
I've seen that video. He doesn't say it once. He says it several times.
And Obama had a roommate who was suspected to have been his gay lover at one point, named Michael, who mysteriously disappeared, was never found, and who, if you look at the pictures of him and look at pictures of Michelle...
Yeah, Michael played football, college football in Oregon. And then sometime after that, Michael disappears off the face of the earth. You know, he meets Michelle. And if it's the same video I seen, where her dress is fitting perhaps a little too snugly.
Several places in public, her walking out of buildings or getting into cars or whatever, and it looks like she's adjusting her junk.
Yeah, there's pieces there that shouldn't be.
And then there's this one show, I think it was on the Ellen Show, and she's dancing. And, you know, yeah, and it looks like her junk is swinging under her dress while she's doing these dance moves with Ellen.
Who was I listening to? It was either Jeff Rentz or John B. Wells one time, several years ago. And they had this woman on from Hawaii who just happened to know Barack Obama when he was living there as a teenager. And she said they called him Barry. And Barry had a reputation of kind of being a bum. You know, if you were smoking a joint or something, he'd want some. He would borrow money and never pay you back. And Barry had access to drugs quite often when he couldn't afford them. And his drug dealer was a well-known homosexual. So this woman said it was pretty much common knowledge that was Barry's boyfriend. So is it true? Is it not true? I don't know, but it kind of coincides and gives credence to the questions about Michelle or Michael.
Right. Well, you remember Joan Rivers was asked the question one day about, you know, will the United States, you know, ever have its first gay president? And she said, what do you mean? We already do.
Yeah.
And she said, Barack Obama is gay. Michelle's a tranny. Everybody knows it.
Yeah, and then she said, it's okay. Everybody knows.
Yeah. And it wasn't like she was making an anti-gay comment or a homophobic comment, because she had literally given this interview as she was finishing up officiating a gay marriage. So it wasn't like this was a homophobic comment in any way, or that she would be considered homophobic. But she mysteriously died on the operating table in a very routine surgery just a few days later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, when she was talking to the reporter, it wasn't a slur against him or anything. You know, the reporter, like you said, was just like, do you think we'll ever see a gay president? She said, well, we've already got one.
Yeah.
Michelle's a tranny. It's okay. Everybody knows. You know,
Yeah.
She was just like, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, mysteriously she dies. And there are still people dying at the hands of the Clintons. You know, every now and then a headline pops up. So-and-so that was influential in this, and whatever it is, it's always tied to some scandal they were involved in. And what do you know? They just died.
Yeah. I am looking at the clock, and we are out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I want to thank you for spending the last hour with us. And this is the April 5th broadcast. I'm actually finishing up the editing here just a couple days before, having just returned from Cuba. And so I made mention of that early in the broadcast, that when this actually aired, I may have been home from Cuba. And that is the case. Had a wonderful time in Havana. We'll tell you about it maybe a little bit next week. But for now, just like to encourage you to go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. I would love to send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag, when you visit the website. And so from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, until next week, God bless.